All right, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us tonight. And I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which we all gather and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So tonight we're going to have a presentation with Sue Brunskill about weed identification. This webinar has been supported by the rural city of Wangaratta through funding from an Australian government initiative, Communities Combating Pest and Weed Impacts During Drought program. So Sue has worked for many years with weeds, for over 30 years actually with weeds in the horticultural industry, bush regeneration and farming. She's taught weed management at TAFE for many years as well and has always been passionate about Landcare. She has worked with her husband Colin and protected 32 hectares of bush on their 50-hectare property at Wurrigi in northeast Victoria. She is an active member of the Wurrigi Landcare group, and Sue's knowledge, enthusiasm and optimism has helped farmers, lifestylers and gardeners understand how quickly they can make a difference to biodiversity, erosion, weed management and water quality in their own patch. So I'd like to welcome Sue tonight and hand over to Sue.
Thanks, Alandi, and thanks to the rural city of Wangaratta. Hello, everybody. Of course, we'd love to be seeing you face to face, but Zoom does have its benefits, and so welcome everyone. I'm really happy to be talking to you about weeds. It's because you can't be a good land manager without really recognising what are the plants that you want to encourage and what are the plants that you want to discourage. So knowing about desirable and undesirable plants, and that is if you're a manager of bushland or roadsides or farming or whatever. So tonight, people that know me would know that I could talk for 3 days straight about weeds. And so just to save you that, I'm going to show you some slides, and that should keep me in control, I think. So tonight I'm going to talk a bit about how do I decide if it's a weed, why do I need to know, and how to identify weeds. So let's go to the first slide. So why do we need to be able to identify plants? So to know if it's a desirable plant or an undesirable plant, and then to be able to manage that well. So if it's a weed, you want to manage it before it becomes a huge problem, because anyone that's had anything to do with weeds will know that the longer you leave it and the more it spreads, the more expensive it becomes to control it, but also the more time consuming and also harder to actually manage the land for what you want. So grasses usually drop seed in their first year. And the old saying of 1 year's seeding, 7 years weeding is a gross underestimate for some weeds. So things like the peas, like Genista and Scotch broom, and a lot of those pea family plants will actually last in the soil for 20 or 30 years. So if we can get the weeds before they actually drop the seeds into the soil bank, and we don't get a build-up of seeds in the soil bank, then we've really much further ahead at controlling weeds. But when we've got a big seed bank, that's when it becomes more difficult and more expensive. Wangaratta, the rural city of Wangaratta actually has 6 weeds of national significance, and lots of noxious weeds like everywhere. So it does have some weeds that have been shown to be a problem at an Australia-wide level. So if it's a weed, we want to know it, and we want to know it soon. If it's a desirable plant, we don't want to kill it. And rural city of Wangaratta has more than 130 rare or threatened species in Wangaratta Shire. And also even in a farming situation, native grasses are really coming to the fore. Well, they have been for quite a while as a great pasture grazing plant. So if we do have some native grasses moving in, and particularly this year they have been moving in and expanding, then we want to be able to encourage that and not just go, oh, that's a new grass, I'll kill it. There are lots of native grasses and weed grasses that actually look similar as well. So it is really good to be able to identify them. Oh, and sorry, I just wanted to go back. That plant at the top is a native raspberry, Rubus parvifolius, and the bottom one is the blackberry. And I think from my experience, there's been more native raspberry sprayed as a weed on roadsides than probably any other native plant. So native raspberry looks a little bit similar to blackberries, but lots of people haven't noticed that, and a lot has been sprayed out. So is it a weed? A plant isn't good or bad, or a weed or not a weed. It depends on the situation in which it grows and the management aim of the land. So this is a photo just down the road from me in Warragee. There's a fence up there you can see. On the left of that fence, there's a whole paddock of very dense phalaris that anyone that had cattle would just drool over. It's a fantastic paddock of phalaris. Highly desirable plant if you're interested in cattle grazing. The minute it jumps over that fence there and lands on the roadside, it becomes quite a bad environmental weed for a number of reasons, and it's particularly so in wet areas along creeks and things. So it's really big and robust, and it sort of elbows out any native plants, and that's kangaroo grass that you can see in front. But if this is your escape route in a fire, this phalaris burns at an incredibly high temperature compared to kangaroo grass. I actually meant to look it up, but it's like about 5 or 6 times as hot. So if I was trying to escape, I'd rather have kangaroo grass on the roadside than phalaris. So we are going to spend some time a bit later about ID, but before we talk about identification and is it a weed, we actually need to be conscious about noxious weeds. So obnoxious weeds aren't just really horrible or obnoxious, as I've had people suggest to me, but they come under an Act of Parliament with legal requirements for management by landholders. And they affect primary production and Crown land and the environment and community health. So we all, if we're managing land, need to be conscious of noxious weeds. So there are different levels. Either if we think they're not a problem, if we like them, we still have an obligation to manage them. And there are different levels of required treatment. And so if you look up Ag Vic, the biosecurity section and the weed section, it will go through those 4 different levels. So there are different categories. There's regionally prohibited weeds and regionally controlled weeds and restricted weeds, and this state prohibited weed is one of the ones on the state prohibited weed list, and you've probably never seen it because it's very unlikely to be in Victoria because these plants have been thought to be so bad that we must jump on them straight away. So they have different categories, and the other 3, not the state prohibited, but the other 3 actually have different status in different parts of the state because they're not necessarily a weed in all parts of the state. So if you go to have a look at that agriculture biosecurity weeds website, it will tell you. So that's all I'm going to say about noxious weeds at the moment, but just keep that in mind that does sort of override a lot of things. So questions to decide management of a plant. Always, what is the management aim of the land? So if it's a bit of bushland, it will have really different management aims than if it's a pasture or if it's, and different pastures, if you've got cattle and you're grazing cattle, you'll have a different management aim than if you've got 10 acres and you just want to keep a few sheep on, marginal land. So what's the management aim of the land? Because as we saw with the phalaris, that actually affects if it's a weed or not. What plant is it? So ID is really important. As I said, a lot of them look quite similar. You can do some, it's really good to do some, observation is probably undervalued, I think. So observation of what's going on, but also some research. So when we're saying, is it a weed and how bad is it and what harm is it causing? Is it causing horehound's a real problem to wool? It contaminates wool. Gorse is really bad for farming land and bushland. Valeris is bad for fire hazard. Willows for water. So what harm is it causing? The other thing we need to look at is how does it propagate? How does it actually spread? So if it's a seed and it's wind spread, like thistles, or bird spread, like the privets and things, and blackberry, or foxes spreading briar rose, or water spread, or animals. So thinking about how quickly will it spread if I don't control it? And does it need controlling? How quickly does it need to be controlled? And we'll talk about that a little bit later. If you've got 5 years till it actually drops seed, maybe you've got a few years up your sleeve. But it is if it's something that's going to drop seed quickly, you need to prioritise that quickly. How to identify plants? Now, there is no plant identification gene. We use the same skills for plant ID as we do for other identification. You know, if old cars are your passion, then you'll have really good observation skills. You'll do some research and you'll remember it. If you're into movies, you'll be able to recognise movie stars, or so there are no different skills to plant ID. It's just about looking carefully, doing a bit of research and remembering. So things like, and using lots of our senses. So looking, is it shiny? Is it, raspy? Is it lots of different things? The feel. So there's a picture up the top there of horehound. Horehound's in the Lamiaceae family, the mint family, and it's got a really strong smell. And all the plants in the mint family will have a strong smell. So when I see a plant that I don't know, I look at it obviously, but probably the second thing I do is I get a little bit of the leaf and I rub it in my fingers and I smell it, because different plants are put into different families and families have different smells. So I might go to WA and never seen a plant before, but I can often tell what family it is, and that helps me with ID. You might want to keep a weed scrapbook. So if you go and do all this sort of research and you find out about lots about it, you might want to write down things like its name, its botanical name, what families it's in, but also the things that really help you identify it. And particularly if you've got a couple of plants that you always get mixed up, put them side by side, spend 5 minutes writing out there, writing on the sheet what are the differences or the identifying features. And this is a really quick way of getting to know the plants in your area, especially maybe on your farm or on your bit of bush. And I'm saying be nerdy. When I first started plant identification a long time ago, when I first studied horticulture, I thought, I'm never going to learn all these. And I used to sit and do a bit of a flick through a book called Alden Med. It's a weeds book. And I used to do a bit of a flick through that every now and then. And it's actually arranged in plant families. And it's surprising when you do a little bit of that. When you've seen a plant, you go, oh, I've seen that before, and you go looking for it. So I could highly recommend a weed scrapbook, and also be a bit nerdy. Now, plants are divided into 3 different life cycles. So we have annual plants, and they complete their life cycle within a year. And something like Poa annua, the little winter grass, starts flowering 3 weeks after it terminates. So annual plants are often have very small root systems. So if you look at this barnyard grass up the top, this is growing out the back of my place, for the size of the plant, it has a really small root system because it's an annual grass and it's just going to do its thing and then die at the end of summer. And so it's quite easy to pull out. The plant down below it is cooler grass, and you can see the really difficult conditions it's growing in, and it has to have big, strong roots to keep it going. That's a perennial, and this is a highly technical way of telling, but with a perennial grass, if you try and pull it and it doesn't come out easy, it's most likely to be an exotic grass. We only have one annual native grass that grows in this area as far as I know. So is it an annual or is it a perennial? Biennial plants grow the first year generally and flower and form seeds in the second. So this Greater Malene, Verbascum papsis on the left, is it in its rosette stage, and it'll stay like that most of the first year. But on the right of that is that as it's gone into its second year, it's sent up a great spike with lots of flowers on it. So it's changed its form. Often these biennials have a rosette stage first, and that's like saying, I'm not letting anything else grow near me. But then when it wants to be fertilised and spread its seed, it sends up that aerial part. And so often you might have longer than an annual to control that. And perennial plants, they last, from a short-lived perennials, and in fact that Greater Malene can be a little short-lived perennial sometimes. But some of them don't flower for 5 years. So things like Genista and Gorse, they often don't flower for 5 years. So you do have a little bit of time to think about control of those. Is it woody? But it can be non-woody. And I remember reading once that lamb's ears, Plantago lanceolata, tiny little ratty plant can last 14 years. So perennial plants can actually be non-woody as well. Now, if you're not a beginner and you've gone down the plant ID trail a little bit further, I would say learning monocots and dicots is a really good thing. The monocots are the grasses and the sedges and the things like some of the lilies. And often books are divided into monocots and dicots. So if you can look at a plant and go, oh, that's a monocot, you can then go to one of the plant ID books and go to the monocot section. The dicots are the broadleaf plants. And so that's, then you would go to that section of the book. If you're a bit further on still, learning families is a fantastic thing to do for plant ID. Partly because you might go somewhere, as I said, and never seen the plant there, but because you've recognised some of the characteristics of families, you might be able to go, oh, never seen that before, but it's in the Lamiaceae family, so I'll go and look in that section of the book. So I don't want to scare people who haven't got that far, but if you are along the track, that is a really good thing to do. The other thing about learning families is they're put together because of similar characteristics. So most of the daisies have those little Santa Claus, little seeds with parachutes. And so they're wind spread, and so there's a whole lot of characteristics. We identify plants by their reproductive parts, the seed heads and the fruits. So on the left we have marshmallow. It's that funny little cheese-looking fruit. We've got blackberry nightshade, not deadly nightshade, blackberry nightshade with the black berries. The thistles, and they're bird spread and often animal spread. The thistles with their daisy flowers and that they spread in the wind. Willows have got very fluffy seed, and our grasses have got, the grass heads. So if you've got a grass having the different inflorescence or grass head is a really probably vital thing to do for identifying most grasses. Our leaf shape and arrangement. So the venation, we've got, they're the veins in the leaves. So we've got veins that spread out from a midrib. We've got parallel veins, so grasses have parallel veins, and that plantain has parallel veins. And maybe they're palmate, they spread out. The shapes of leaves, the linear is maybe olive, even in trees, olive leaf. Some of these, the palmately lobe would be the maples and things like that. So, and that sagittate leaf would be sheep sorrel. And the arrangement of the leaves, are they simple or are they palmately compound or are they compound leaves? And so each one of those little leaflets is not actually a leaf. Each one of those, that pinnately compound, that's actually one leaf with little leaflets. So that's one leaf. What are the margins like? So entire, that means no serrations, lobed. And then the arrangement on the stem. So if you look at the opposite one, that's pretty self-explanatory. The leaves are opposite each other on the stem, and with the alternate, they're not opposite. And then there are things like whorled. So when you're when you've got a plant and you think you know what it is, and you read the descriptions, these are the sorts of things you need to be looking at. Now, grasses. I did say that there's no specific gene for ID, but I think there might be a specific gene for grass ID. It is a little bit more challenging. We look at the growth type and, is it a clumping grass or is it a running grass? Is it annual? Is it perennial? We look at where they're growing. So Phalaris will be growing in wetter areas. A lot of the native grasses will be growing in the dry areas. I was down along our rail trail the other day at Wurundjeri, an amazingly dry, terrible location, but there were quite a lot of native grasses growing there. Are they cool season or warm season? So Paspalum's a warm season grass, and kangaroo grasses or warm season. It means the season that they grow, and they're sort of pretty dormant over the cool season. So kangaroo grass dies back and is dormant over the winter season. And we have grass and grass-like weed identification keys. And if you're just starting, I wouldn't necessarily leap into that. But if you've done a bit of ID, it might be worth looking up an ID key. And so that's is it, more than 1 metre, or, is it got one thing or the other? And so you go, oh, this thing, and then, oh, is it? So it's a series of questions asking you 2 choices generally. Now, grasses do have specific identification, and particularly that picture on the left. Let's go to the parts of the grass plant. So we've got leaves, and we've got the seed head, also called the inflorescence, the seed head. But the way that the leaf blade is attached to the stem is really a good identifying feature. So we've got ligules, which are either membranes or they can be hairs. So on the left, we've got a variety of different ligules. And this is the part where the sheath, the bit that's holding it to the stem, and the leaf blade, how they attach to the stem. And so you can see there's things like a little membrane on the left one, over to big grassy, big hairs on the one on the right. So looking for that ligule, it's a little bit of or the absence of a ligule. And there are things called auricles that actually hold, and they're like fingers that are, holding on to the stem. The absence of those is just as important an identifying feature as what they're like, and they can be long and claw-like. and the collars where that part where the blade joins, and also the way the leaf buds are, the new leaf buds, are they rolled or folded? So grasses are a little bit of a specialist identifying. We have broadleaf, often two stages, rosette. So we've got up the top, we've got capeweed and then thistle and then patto, although we don't seem to see patto quite as much as that these days. So there's often the two stages, the rosette and then the aerial part of it. One of the things particularly to think about capeweed, if you go spraying capeweed madly, nature doesn't like a bare space. And so you should be thinking too, before you even spray, if you're spraying a big area, what's going to replace this weed when the weed is dead. So that's, it's fine, like if you've just got odd thistles growing in a paddock and you decide you'll spray them. But if you've got a big area, particularly of these broadleaves, and you knock them all out, you do need to think before you've done it, what's going to replace it. So we've got underground parts to look at. So grasses and have most grasses, the clumping grasses have fibrous roots. And in fact, if you're actually controlling these, cutting these out, you don't actually have to cut out all those bottom roots. You just have to cut out that top bit around the crown and the top bit of the root system. Do they have tap roots? So a lot of trees have tap roots, but if you've been seeing a lot of the eucalypts falling over these days, you'll look and see they don't actually have as big a taproot as we often think. But things like flatweed and what some people call dandelion, they have a taproot, and if you just nick off the top, they'll reshoot. So if you're hand pulling or hoeing out those weeds with taproots, you actually need to get the top third of the root, otherwise they'll just regrow. If we've got plants with runners, bottom right, you need to get all of those. As you can see, if you cut one little bit off, then it'll just keep growing. And likewise, if you just pull that out and dump it on the ground, it'll probably keep growing too. And we have plants with corms and bulbs. So oxalis, or the sour grass, it actually has two sorts of bulbs, that very long, thin one and the small one. And if you dig those out, unless you take a huge, big chunk of soil with you, you'll just be spreading those little bulbs around. So things with bulbs, we do need to be really careful. We can't just take the top part because the bulbs will stay in the ground. And on the left is a Watsonia. It's probably not a great picture, but there's actually bulbils on the top of the stem. They have corms underneath, but they have little bulbils attached to the stem. And when they get ripe, the stem falls over and they can spread a couple of metres very easily. Those little bulbils are often set out roots before they even hit the ground. So these will, when you look up Watsonia in a plant ID book, it'll talk about those bulbils. So a few take-home messages, and then we'll have some questions. Identification is vital in weed management and in management of land, whatever we're managing the land for. And so we need to do, observation is highly underrated. Keep an eye and keep what's happening and if something's spreading, and doing research related to the land you're managing and its aims. And always when you're reading a book about weeds, you might be reading about something that grows in Queensland. Think about the northeast. As I said before, the noxious weeds are separate. There are some that are noxious across the whole of the state, but there are actually some that are just in an area. So when you're doing your research, related to the land you're managing, but also its aims. Am I managing for farmland? Am I managing for habitat? Am I managing for species diversity? Am I managing for different sorts of farming? Nature hates vacant space. Think about that before you, it's fine, just small amount of weed control, but if you're doing a lot, think about what's going to take its place, and hopefully that will be a desirable plant, but often only if you plan for that. There is, as I said, no special ID gene. It is like other things. It's a matter of using it, remembering it, looking, and however you learn best, maybe keeping a book. There are masses of resources. There's a few apps if you're into apps. The New South Wales Weedwise one is free. Just go to the normal app store that you use. There is one called Environmental Weeds Australia. I think it's only about $7 or $8. So that's an app for your phone. There's masses of great websites. So Weeds Australia is a pretty good one. But as I said, that Agriculture Victoria Biosecurity Weeds is a really good one to go and visit. And there are lots of great weed books, and there's a new one coming out. So this is not hot off the press. It's still to reach the press, but Landy can catch us up when it's coming. This is Weeds in the Rural City of Wangaratta. So this will be an invaluable book for anyone that lives in Wangaratta. But a lot of these weed books in particular areas can actually be really good for other areas as well. I have a collection of about 20 of these little books from other areas, and they are really useful for ID.